and welcome to this edition of The Scene Show. Great to be with you here on a Wednesday afternoon. And I'm delighted to announce that Father Win Bath stopped by for an interview today, and we have that interview is going to be the focus of this show. And just want to give a quick plug for our Facebook page and for our YouTube channel and for our website, www.thesceneshow.com. Be sure to check those out, where you can find more about myself, about the show. And there's even a blog there that we just started just last night. So check that out, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. Alrighty. And so welcome everyone. My guest at this time is my good friend, Father Win Bath. Father, welcome to the show.
Oh, Tommy, it's such a pleasure to be here with you. Such a fine young man.
No, thank you. So I just wanted to ask a couple of questions about your upcoming 50th anniversary, which is, I believe, May 21st of this year, right?
May the 21st, I think.
Do you think? So what do you have in the works for that celebration?
Well, I think we're going to have a mass. And like all good, appropriate celebration, I think we're going to have something to eat, too, after the mass. And then some people will probably get up to a microphone and tell a bunch of lies about me.
Well, so what's the journey been like over these last 50 years?
Very fast. It seems like I've really only been a priest for about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, and you've spent 30 some odd years here.
36 years in Hudson, 12 years in Troy, and 1 year in Albany.
And what would you say has been the high point of that ministry?
Probably surviving it. Still being here. 14 of us were ordained back in 1972. And of the 14, I'm the only one that's still functioning. So to me, it's just a major grace from God that of the 14 that I would be the one to still be hanging in and still serving as a priest.
Right. Right. And what would you say has sustained you through that time?
Well, I guess probably the grace of God. There's a lot more priests that are much more gifted than I am in so many ways. So I don't think it's myself. I think it was the Lord. Mm-hmm. Probably different members of my family that have prayed for me over the years too.
Mm-hmm. And so, how did your journey to the priesthood sort of materialize? Because I know you have an interesting vocations testimony.
Well, very interesting journey. In many ways, although I was ordained a priest in 1972, probably started in 1943, the year I was born. It was a very interesting situation because my father and his side of the family was Jewish, and my mother, her side of the family was Catholic. My father was the grandson of immigrants that came through the port of New Orleans in 1871 and migrated to East Texas. My mother, her family goes back to 1732, when a man from Alsace-Lorraine by the name of Jacob Troxler left Alsace-Lorraine, immigrated through the port of New Orleans, and they settled in the little small towns outside of New Orleans. And my mother and my father met in Marshall, Texas in the early 1940s. She graduated from high school and she was looking for a job as a secretary. My father was a lawyer and he hired her.
Oh.
And they got to know each other. It was very upsetting because his side of the family, being Jewish, they were upset that my father was marrying a Gentile. And my mother's side of the family was upset because she wasn't marrying a Catholic.
Right, and you always tell that joke that they hadn't. What did something like? What do you care? You haven't been to synagogue in 30 years.
That was another part of the family. That was my father's sister, Aunt Blossom. That was around 1960. Her son Jack was getting married, and she called up my father. She said, "Paul, this is Blossom. Well, what?" She says, "Well, Jack's getting married." And he said, "Oh, Blossom, that's wonderful." She said, "No, Paul, it's not wonderful. He's marrying a Gentile." And my father says, "Well, Blossom," he says, "I haven't been to church or I haven't been to the synagogue in the last 40 years. You haven't been to the synagogue the last 40 years. What difference does it make?" So my cousin Jack went ahead and married Louise, and they had many happy years of married life together, worked out. I think, unfortunately, my father and my mother probably would have had a long-lasting marriage, too. Tragically, I was born in September of 1943, and about 6 months before I was born, my father found himself in the army and overseas in Europe in the middle of World War II.
Oh, really?
And so my mother was left in Marshall, Texas, basically to kind of deal with things on her own, although her mother and her brother and sister were there too. So I was born in September of 1943. And a few minutes after I was born, the doctor came out and told my grandmother and my uncle and another aunt and uncle that everything was okay except for the fact that my mother had some slight bleeding, and they hoped to take care of that soon, and then everything would be fine. Well, he comes out another 20 minutes later and says, "Well," he says, I hate to say this, but we're having difficulty stopping the bleeding." And at that point, my uncle said, "Well," he said, "we all have the same blood type." He says, "If she needs more blood," he says, "you can take some of mine." His doctor says, "Oh, no, that's not going to be necessary." And then about another 20 minutes, he comes out and tells him that my mother had passed away.
Wow.
Which was, just very startling and very upsetting for everybody involved. And I'm just kind of telling you this on secondhand information.
Yeah.
The next thing I know is that a couple of days later, my father's mother, my Jewish grandmother, came to the hospital and basically scooped me up and took me back to her house.
Oh, really?
With the intention of, raising me as a nice young Jewish boy.
Yeah.
And basically just kind of just told my mother's side of the family to get lost.
Yeah.
She had everything under control.
Yeah.
And so she was looking after me. And then, from what I understand, around December of 1943, my father was stationed in Liverpool, England. And there he ran into a single woman, and they went out a few times. It turned out that she was my stepmother, and by April of 1944, they were married. So basically, there was my father, my stepmother, and then toward the end of that year, my sister Trudy was born in Liverpool, England, too. And, of course, I hadn't seen any. I was back in a crib, still back in Marshall, Texas. So sometime in 1944, my father returns home. My stepmother returns home with, their daughter and my sister Trudy. And family life is supposed to get underway. And so I don't know too much about those early years. The first thing I know is one of my earliest memories is I was about 3 years old.
Yeah.
And then my younger brother Edwin was born. And so at this point, Edward was born in the United States, and so my mother was Church of England. Of course, now that was another part of it. She was quite shocked to find out is that my father had been married to a Catholic woman. Her whole attitude was British Anglican, that, oh, those horrible Catholics. So she decreed that I was to have no contact with my mother's family, no awareness that I had any, in a sense, Catholic tradition in my background. So that was concealed from me for years. And so when my brother was a few months old, my stepmother said, well, we need to get Edwin baptized. And then she said, well, she says, has Winston ever been baptized? My father said, well, no, I don't think so. She says, well, let's just go ahead and get him baptized at the same time. So my brother Edward was baptized, and I was baptized too. So I was 3 years old at the time. So it's interesting. I remember being picked up and then having warm water poured over my head and being baptized in the Episcopal Church. And kind of we started going on from there, being the typical American family.
Right.
That means totally dysfunctional. And every once in a while, my stepmother would start to have these religious feelings and decree that we should all start attending church and going to Sunday school. So we go to Sunday school, and we'd attend for a few months. She'd take us to church occasionally, and then after a few months, her enthusiasm waned, and that kind of came to an end. She'd be too busy and too tired, and we'd go a few years and not doing much of anything, and then all of a sudden, well, you all got to go to church again and rev it up. So about 2 or 3 cycles of that. But between the time I was baptized and I was graduating from high school, I'd only been in church about maybe 40 or 50 times my entire life.
And I think you had said that the faith was really a part of the culture growing up.
Yeah, that was the main thing. Faith was a part of the culture. When I went to school, each day they had a reading from the Bible. They had prayers. Every couple of weeks they brought in one of the local ministers, and he gave us a spiritual talk. And so different things one way or another, religion was kind of inculcated into the school curriculum. I remember I was in the 5th grade, and we had nap time after lunch. We'd all lie on our little blankets on the floor, and the teachers would read to us. In the 5th grade, the teacher got a child's version of the Bible, and she read to us the whole Old Testament, at least the child's version of it. So that's was my first exposure to pretty much most of the Bible. So it was good. So I was getting some kind of religious education, even though I really wasn't aware of it. And of course, on television, there was so many shows where, faith was just a part of it. They would have the Loretta Young show where she often played a nun and stories about priests. And one thing and another. And you'd have people like Red Skelton that always close off the show, good night, God bless you all. And then there was Tennessee Ernie Ford, and he'd have to close every one of his shows by singing a hymn. So, faith was just pretty much in the culture at that point.
And then how did you end up going from that sort of Episcopal and Church of England background into the Catholic Church? Well,
that's a strange story. Like I said, my stepmother decreed I was have nothing to do with my real mother's side of the family. But each birthday and each Christmas, I would get a Christmas card or birthday card. And I'd open up and it said, Merry Christmas, love, Mama. That was kind of the way she wanted to be called. And I'd say, well, who's the... They'd say, we'll explain it to you later when you're older. And finally, as I got older, kind of different pieces started coming together. And I started kind of learning more about my past. And then it was my senior year in high school. I had a driver's license, and at that point I had the use of the family car. If I had to go to the library to do research for a paper, they didn't want to cart me around, so they say, "Here are the car keys. Go down and be back in time for supper."
Yep.
So one afternoon, I said, "Well, can I use the car for seminarians?" They said, "Fine." So I had these cards with the addresses, so I drove over to the address in Marshall, Texas, and went to the house, and there was my grandmother. And, we had a very traumatic reunion with each other.
Yeah.
And so, that was kind of a chance to see each other and talk to each other.
Right.
Very awkward and very complicated, but we made contact.
Yeah.
So I let her know that I was going to go to RPI in Troy to study chemistry. And when I got up to RPI, I sent her my address.
Yeah.
And she wrote back to me. And then a couple of weeks later, I got another letter. And it was saying, "You don't know me, but I'm your mother's sister. I'm a sister of the Holy Cross in Boston. I'm Sister Marguerite. And I'd love it if you could come over for a visit." And at that point I said, "Holy mackerel." I said, "I've got Catholics in my family."
Yeah.
Part of that was the big shock is because all the time, growing up in East Texas, it was like, unless you were Baptist, unless you were Methodist, spiritually you were nobody.
Didn't amount to anything. Yeah.
And the last thing you wanted to be was one of those weird and crazy Catholics. All of a sudden they found out that, my family were those weird and crazy Catholics.
But I remember you said you had such a warm welcome by the from them. Was it from them or the Catholics?
Well, that's right. I went over
encountering.
So I went over to Cardinal Cushing College in Boston late October and spent a weekend there. And my aunt, she lived in a convent with 20 other sisters.
Right.
We were all associated with this Catholic college called Cardinal Cushing College. And part of it is they were just so warm and welcoming, just like a bunch of nuns right out of The Sound of Music. Just so friendly and affirming and solicitous and stuff like that. And I came back and said, "Well, these Catholics are a lot nicer than I ever thought they were supposed to be."
Yeah. Yeah.
I went over for several visits, and it was that same thing. They always left with this warm, fuzzy feeling that it was just kind of it's just kind of like a home away from home. It was just a welcoming and cordial place, and lots of warmth and affirmation.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when I was going through RPI, it was a place of struggle. College, your first year away from family and everything else, can be a tough experience.
Yeah.
Left me with a lot more questions than answers, and especially part of what got the journey going too was my very first semester. We had to take a course called Introduction to the Humanities. And it was basically just asking questions. Well, what does it mean to be a real person? What does it mean to be an authentic person?
Yeah.
And I remember our teacher, he got up there and he said, "My name is Jerry Thomas." He said, "I was an engineer for a major corporation in New Jersey for about a decade." And he said, finally, I had enough. And he says, "I gave it up, and I'm back here at RPI, and I'm teaching now." He says, "And I'm out here, and I'm looking at all of you." And he said, "I know what you're thinking, because I thought it too. I'm here at a good college. I'm going to have a good education.
Yeah.
And I'm going to get lots of money. I'm going to have a great job, and I'm going to be very happy."
Yeah.
And he said, "Believe me," he says, "it doesn't work out that way." He says, "I've experienced it." He said, "Corporate life can chew you up and make you absolutely miserable." And I was saying, that's what I was planning on. He's telling me.
Yeah.
That just from a general secular point of view, it wasn't going to be the great thrill that most of us thought it was going to be.
Right.
So that got me thinking too, what I was planning really wasn't going to work out.
Yeah.
And so it was my very last chemistry lab, my freshman year, and I remember the lab was upstairs on the second floor of the chemistry building.
Yeah.
And coming down the stairs in front of us, there was a big bulletin board, and it had job offerings, and from quite a few different major corporations. And the one that stuck out in my mind, it says, Procter & Gamble is looking for 4 chemists to work in its soap division. So I looked at that and I said to myself, is that what you want to do for the rest of your life, is learn how to make a better bar of soap? And I had this conversation, and I said, I don't think so. And so I just said to myself, well, what do you want to do? And I remember looking at the paper and just saying, yeah, well, what do I want to do with the rest of my life?
Yeah.
And then somehow, somewhere out of the middle of nowhere, it's like James Earl Jones, that deep voice says, become a priest.
And you hadn't thought about it up to this point.
I hadn't even thought about it. And I mean, it was almost like I'd been, struck by lightning. It just kind of sent a shock through my system. And I just said, where in the heck did that come from?
Right.
And I just kind of stumbled back to my dorm room, and I spent the next few days just thinking, what in the heck was all of that about? And I said, well, I kept saying, become a priest. I said, I liked being with my aunt. I liked the priests that were over there at Cardinal Cushing College. They were very nice guys. And I said, maybe that's what I should be doing. So.
And now you weren't Catholic at that point in time either, right?
I was still kind of, you might say, baptized pagan at that point. But I said, well, I'm going to go over and find the Catholic chaplain.
Yeah.
And just kind of see where this leads. So found out where the Catholic chaplain's office was. Mm-hmm. And I walk in, and I didn't have any idea of what a priest looked like. So I was kind of said, is the chaplain here? And they pointed to a guy that was sitting in a chair.
Yeah.
Of course, he had a black shirt and a white collar. So he said, well, I'm the priest. I'm the chaplain, Father Tom Phelan. And so I said to him, I said, well, you don't know me, but I said, my name is Winston Bath, and I think I want to become a priest and a Catholic too. So he kind of looked at me kind of surprised and kind of smiled, and he said, well, he said, sounds like a good thing to have a conversation about. So he pulled out his appointment book. He said, a couple of nights, he says, I'm free if you want to come over to my place. Yeah. He says, we'll sit down, we'll have a conversation. Mm-hmm. So we met a couple of nights later, and I kind of started telling him about my story.
Right.
And so he said, I've never had quite an experience like this. He said, but if you're interested, he said, I'll be glad to work with you. He said, you've got to look at it this as a series of steps. He says, first of all, you've got to really make a decision. Do you really want to be serious about being a Catholic?
Right.
He said, so the first thing is you have to decide you want to be a Catholic and become a Catholic. Mm-hmm. He said, probably then you have to spend some time living as a Catholic.
Yeah.
And then only then deciding whether or not you want to seriously think about priesthood. Mm-hmm. So can we take a break for a minute? Or
yes.
I need to get some.
Okay, we're back.
Okay. And so in September of 1963, I started meeting with Tom Phelan once a week, and he started taking me through the instructions in the faith.
Yeah.
And it was a very good experience. And I think some of the things that were interesting, because a lot of the different points that, kind of gave me encouragement was that I was pretty much getting a Southern Baptist perspective on the scriptures. Like my Baptist friends would say, Jesus did not turn the water into wine, he turned the water into grape juice.
Yeah.
And that whole thing of having a pope and everything else, that was something that happened later in the church that had nothing to do with Jesus.
Yeah.
But you look at the scriptures of Matthew, and Jesus says to Peter, you are the rock on whom I'm going to build my church.
Yeah.
I give to you the keys of the kingdom, but you're going to be my prime minister.
Yeah.
And, a lot of passages like that kind of really pointed out that the positions that the Catholic Church held were not just simply things that were dreamt up by theologians along the way.
Right.
They're all firmly rooted in Scripture.
Right.
Also, the same thing about, the Eucharist, Holy Communion. Baptists believe it's just a symbol.
A symbol.
It might have, at the Last Supper, the bread might have or the bread and the grape juice.
Right.
Might have become the body and blood, but it only happened once if it happened at all. But after that, it was just a symbol from that point on.
Mm-hmm. And your theology kind of developed over time, right? It wasn't something you, it took years. I think you said it took years to develop that sense of the scriptures.
It did, because the main thing was I go into the seminary, and basically it was back to the Baptist years. You had guys that doubted that Jesus established a church, that he established the papacy, that he really intended, the Eucharist to truly be his body and blood. So I had to kind of really do a lot of sorting, figure out, well, exactly what is the truth.
And were there any individuals that helped you along the way in that journey?
There were, but let me just ask you this: should we get back to the main part of the journey first?
Well, wherever you.
So, anyway, I was received into the church, actually conditionally baptized in May of 1964.
Yeah.
And just before going back to Texas, I'd sent my folks a letter explaining that I had become a Catholic.
Yeah.
Which really ticked them off to no end. And I remember getting down there a day or two later, my stepmother said, "It was that damn aunt of yours. She got a hold of you, didn't she?"
Yeah.
I just kind of ignored it, but I said she was right. So, but Tom Phelan at that point, had kind of really become like a friend and a mentor.
Yeah.
And the next year, he was living in a rectory as a chaplain for the Sisters of the Good Shepherd.
Yeah.
That lived on the edge of the RPI campus.
Mm-hmm.
And at that point, they moved out.
We're good.
And so Tom was basically just had one job at that point as a chaplain at RPI. But they continued to let him use the rectory, so he invited me to live there.
Yeah.
And in exchange for room and board, I, mow the grass, rake the leaves, shovel the snow.
Yeah.
Do the dishes, do the laundry, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So my remaining years at RPI, I lived there in the rectory. So, I saw Tom and priesthood, very up close and personal.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that he advised me to do, he said, there's a lot of guys that are leaving the priesthood now. He said, I think it would be good that you finish your time at RPI, that you have a degree. So if you do study for the priesthood and it doesn't work, you have something to fall back on.
Yeah.
Where you have the credentials to get a decent job and support yourself.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a good idea, too, so I stayed at RPI
so you finished your chemistry degree.
1970. So I became a philosophy major for 1 year.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, for 1 year. I have to say, excuse me, all you seminarians, whoever, but I did not find philosophy a thrilling and motivating experience. In fact, what happened was I took a course in Chaucer at the same time, and all of a sudden I found myself, here was a college course that I really found exciting. I don't know why, but I loved Chaucer. It was, just delightful. So I ended up becoming a language and literature major.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's how I graduated from RPI. I have a BS in language and literature. So I tell people, I said, I'm one of the few priests in the Diocese of Albany that is a certified BS.
Yeah.
So my last year, we talked about it again. I said, I still feel that I want to study for the priesthood. So
Yeah.
Tom got me lined up with diocesan officials, and I was accepted. And in the fall of 1967, they had me at a place called Our Lady of Angels Seminary in Glenmont, New York, that is no longer there, but it was kind of a in-between year just to kind of make a transition, from a secular college to a seminary life.
Yeah.
Which wasn't good. I needed it because when you're a student at RPI, they don't care what you do or where you go or anything like that.
Yeah.
No, as long as you show up and you get passing marks on your test or your papers, you're free to do whatever you want to, whenever you want to.
Yeah, and seminary is not like that.
There was a lot more structure, so I had to, learn what it meant to live a structured life. And part of it was the vice rector called me into his office 2 or 3 times, telling me that I was failing to meet their expectations.
Yeah,
I was not adjusting to the routine and the program, so I wasn't happy about that. But I said, when they said you have a choice, either you do it our way or you get out of here. I said, well, I guess I better learn to do it their way. And it was good because as I got into the routine and adjusted to the program, in many ways, it was a very freeing. It's because, you knew at 1 o'clock where you had to be. And I knew that between 3 and 5, that was my time. Each afternoon I could do whatever I wanted to.
Yeah.
But it was, the days passed so quickly because there was an order and a structure that, a framework for just a good, wholesome
I remember
daily activities.
I remember one conversation you and I had where you mentioned the structure of the seminary, and you said it may seem like a pain in the ass now, but that I would appreciate that structure more when I, as I got older and got out into ministry.
Right.
So you definitely say that that time of having that structure played a role later on in your life and made a positive difference.
I think it did. Oh, yeah. I think part of it probably, helped me free it from, that independent streak. I guess you might call it the original pin.
Yeah.
I'm my own person. I can make my decisions. I don't want anybody else interfering and running my life.
Yeah.
And we know that a life of faith is that, as a priest, it's not only, they're going to be people with your parish priest, it's going to be your bishop. But also, and in most parishes, you're going to find out that every parish has at least 2 or 3 dozen pastors.
Yeah.
That are constantly telling you things for your own good of what you need to be doing here and there. But also, it really comes back to the biblical thing, as recognizing that it's the Lord has sovereignty over our lives too.
Amen.
As being a person of faith, regardless in whatever state, single, religious priest, or married, there's that someone that always has sovereignty over you, and that you don't get to call all the shots yourself.
Yeah. Well, that was actually one of the key questions that I had to ask you was, what advice would you have for a seminarian in today's world?
Advice for seminarians in today's world. First of all, don't take yourself too seriously. That's the first part of it. And also, what was it? We had a wonderful sister here, Sister Adelina. She had a great sense of humor. I guess that's probably the other part of it. Keep a good sense of humor.
Yeah.
Or another one is, here's a good one I'm looking. Start each day with a good prayer, a good laugh, and a good glass of prune juice.
Yep.
And don't take yourself too seriously, but I'm sure some of it, learn from Father Anthony. Try as a seminarian to get your framework of your life, into the pattern of what the framework of a priest would be.
Yeah.
The emphasis upon, space each day, time for the Lord, time for prayer.
Yeah.
Keep working at that, that good solid foundation of there's always got to be space for prayer each day.
Right.
I think part of it, too, is recognizing that sometimes you think that as you're learn all of this theology is that you're going to be ordained and you're going to know the answer to everything. To kind of come to recognize is that there's more you don't know than you do know.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, we're not going to have all the answers.
Right.
So, so that's part of it. Is get your life structured, especially get the prayer in there. Don't take yourself too seriously. I would say another thing too is get a good mentor, somebody that you have a sense, that will care about you and respect you, somebody that you can confide in. Whether that would also be your confessor too, but somebody that also can, speak truth to you. Two things is that, help, affirm, the good qualities that you've got going. There's some people that can be very critical and very judgmental.
Yeah.
You don't need somebody that's always telling you everything that you're doing wrong.
Right.
But sometimes it would be helpful if there's somebody that can tell you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Things where you do need to work on in your life too.
Yeah.
But in a loving and caring and supportive way. So it's good to, if you can find a person like that.
Yeah.
Maybe the thing, a lot of times is maybe you just have to, start off and just make a try. Say, well, I'll try this person, see what it's like. If it works, fine. If it doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's Father Benedict Grachel, the great Franciscan priest. And he was talking about, I think, to some seminarians and encouraging them. He said, find yourself a good confessor. And he says, and remember this. He says, when you go into that confessional, he says, you have a right to be treated with kindness. You have a right to be treated with compassion. Mm-hmm. And he said, if you go into confession and you're opening up your heart, sharing the most vulnerable side of yourself, and you're not being treated with respect and kindness, just walk out and go find a priest that will treat you with kindness.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good point. So you don't not necessarily find exactly what you're looking for the first time.
Right.
But look for somebody that can guide you and speak truth to you, encourage you, but also challenge you when you need to be challenged. And just say, well, Tommy, do you really think you're going to have a Porsche in order to be happy as a priest?
Right. Yeah. So.
But so what other thing? Also, one of the things I learned to appreciate from Father Anthony too. Also, try and be as visible and available to as many people as you can.
Yeah.
And I'm more of an introvert than an extrovert.
Oh, really? I wouldn't have guessed that.
Oh, yeah.
No, I wouldn't have guessed that.
I've gotten a lot better as the years, but
yeah.
But most of my years in the seminary, they'd have gatherings. I would just try and find a quiet place and just kind of hunker down.
Yeah. Me too. Yeah.
Just kind of wait. Well, maybe there's somebody here that'll kind of come over. And nobody ever. One thing is, if you hunker and hope somebody's going to come over and talk to you, you're going to be hunkering and waiting a lot.
You're going to be hunkering and waiting a long time, huh?
And part of it these days, there are a lot of good books and things out. Read books of how to, have good conversations with people or how to socialize. There's a a lot of hints. Is that one of the things I do is especially if I'm meeting seminarians or different people, say, well, now tell me, what got you thinking about a vocation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, you learn just a few basic 2 or 3 questions, and eventually you can find yourself having
Yeah.
some very enjoyable conversations.
Yeah. Well, much like this conversation, I appreciate you giving your time.
And part of it is, I get just, are we?
Well, well, we can keep going. I think we're past the half an hour.
Oh, we are? Okay. Well, we can just make a whole conversation about what what advice would you give to a seminarian or
Yeah.
a young priest?
Yeah. Yeah.
So we should.
Yeah. Why don't we? Because I think my battery's getting low here.
Good.
So I think we'll wrap it up for today, so it'll save, and then maybe we'll come back with a part 2 some other time. All right. Well, thank you, Father.
Okay, Tommy.
And many thanks again to Father Bath for being on the show. We ended the interview there because I was worried that our battery was running low and didn't want to lose the great information and the great content that we had already had. So what a great conversation! What a great priest and a good, just a really good mentor to me. And so thank you to him for being on the show once again. And that's all for today. So be sure to click like, click subscribe wherever you're listening, and we will see you next week with part 2 of our series on the Trinity, and I believe we're up to part 6 of the overall series on the history of Christian thought. That's coming to you Monday. Then don't miss the Song of the Week on Tuesday. And as far as the interview series goes, that'll probably be on a monthly basis to start, or every other week, or enough, just to give us enough leeway, enough wiggle room to schedule guests, make appointments, and all of that good stuff. So thank you for listening. God bless, and have a good week.